get so many questions about the Osmo Action 4, the stabilization, the cinematic settings and Gyroflow that I'm just not going to answer everything in the comments, so I'm making yet another dedicated video showing you why ND filters, cinematic settings and Gyroflow just don't mix and match really well. Let's go. Now, before I start talking about how cinematic settings, ND filters, Gyroflow on action cameras actually make no sense, we have to first talk about the type of stabilization that the cameras have. And there's two types of stabilization. You have the active stabilization and then you have the passive stabilization. Now, the active stabilizers, or the ones where you physically stabilize the camera, like if you use a gimbal or if you have in-body image stabilization where the sensor is literally floating in the magnetic field and then the camera is shaking around it, and it really does a good job to a certain degree. But if you use a gimbal, then you're counteracting all of these twists and turns. You only get a bit of motion like this. And this is a really good way of stabilizing your video, but it's not as strong and as smooth as the electronic stabilization that the cameras do. Now, if you use electronic stabilization like Rocksteady on the Osmo Action, or Hyper Smooth on GoPro, or Solid State or something, or Gyroflow for instance, well, then you're using the actual motion data that the camera is recording, the actual physical motion and rotation, and then the video gets cropped in and the frame is being moved in the opposite direction. Now, this is where Gyroflow does a really better job than what cameras do internally, because it uses a different algorithm. It kind of stretches the video in a spherical way and then it moves it around in a spherical direction, like you can see here in this example. And cameras don't actually have that much of a sophistication. Plus, with Gyroflow, you can actually tweak how much you want the stabilization to be applied. But there is this one big issue with that, and that is that you're stabilizing after the video was already recorded. And this is where the cinematic settings, that 180-degree shutter rule, messes up the whole thing. So what is that 180-degree shutter rule? People typically say that you have to double your frame rate in terms of shutter speed, and that's the 180-degree shutter rule. But more precisely, the definition would be that you have to have the maximum exposure time that every frame gets when the video is recorded. If you're shooting with 24, or in my case, since I live in Europe, 25 frames per second, well, the maximum exposure time for every frame is 1/25th of a second. But that would produce too much motion blur because the shutter speed is too slow. Now, if you apply the 180-degree shutter rule, then you have to reduce that time by half. So 1/25th of a second, half of that, or twice as fast, would be 1/50th of a second shutter speed. Now, this coincidentally produces just the right amount of motion blur. And if you're using just 25 or 24 frames per second, then if you do a panning motion, you can see every frame. You can almost count the frames because there's not enough frames in the video. But if you add that 1/50th of a second shutter speed, then all the frames get kind of blurred and blended together, and the video sensation is much smoother. And if you're shooting action shots where things are moving really fast, then that motion blur is really going to emphasize the speed. But it's also going to mess with the stabilization. Okay, so now that we know what that 180-degree shutter rule is, it's basically that 1/50th of a second shutter speed motion blur. Now, the problem is that when we're recording an action video, the camera is really shaking, and the stabilizer, of course, stabilizes it, but that shakiness actually records the motion blur that's being captured. Here's an example without any stabilization. Now, it's a shaky video footage, but if I stabilize it using Gyroflow, for instance, you can see that the video now is stable, but you see all the motion blur that was captured because my camera was shaking in my hand as I was running. So this is why for action shots, 1/50th of a second shutter speed, or the 180-degree shutter rule, or the cinematic settings as they're called, really make no sense. So whenever you hear an influencer on YouTube telling you that you have to use ND filters and cinematic settings for your action shots, well, that's just really not being honest, because every commercial that you see with action shots, with action cameras, or shot with shutter speeds that are way faster than 1/50th of a second. I mean, 1/200th of a second, maybe even 1/1000th of a second, so that every frame is crystal clear. Now, most of these ads, if you haven't noticed, are shot with a faster frame rate, and the playback is also faster, like 60 frames per second. And with 60 frames per second, you don't actually need any motion blur because the video is smooth already. And in those cases where the frame rate is slow, like 24 or 25 frames per second, even 30 frames per second, well then trust me on this, motion blur is added in post-production, because there's just no way that you can electronically stabilize a shaky video with motion blur and have it be looking the way you see it in the ads. That's just a marketing gimmick, and it's kind of dishonest. But anyway, even on this channel, I'm showing ND filters and how to use them, and I always explain when they work and when you should really not use them. I mean, they're useful for drone shots because drone shots are typically not very violent and shaking. But for action cameras on downhill mountain bike strips, yeah, no, just no ND filter. Shoot with a fast shutter speed and then add motion blur in post. That's really just the only way to go. So thank you for supporting me through my affiliate links. Okay, I'm gonna go back into the field to finish off this video. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel if you're new. And if you wanna watch last week's video, then click on this one over here. Thank you, and I'll see you in this one. Bye bye.